"Please take my daughter instead. I'll do anything," the desperate mother cries, clutching her worn shawl as the towering rancher dismounts his stallion in the dusty street. The crowd sneers at the widowed seamstress, another broken woman begging for scraps. Her fate seems sealed. Watch her innocent daughter marry into cruelty or face exile into the unforgiving wilderness. But when the weathered rancher removes his hat and meets her eyes, something unexpected flickers between them. "Will you marry me?" he asks, his words cutting through the desert air like thunder. The town falls silent. What they don't know is that both the desperate mother and the mysterious rancher harbor secrets that could reshape everything. Secrets that powerful men would kill to keep buried. And that could either save them both or destroy everything they've built. Can a marriage born from desperation become the key to justice, or will their hidden truths seal their doom? The dust kicked up from Main Street as Verity Washington pressed her ear against the thin cabin wall. Sheriff Morrison's boots thudded against her porch boards like a death march. She pulled her shawl tighter and opened the door before he could knock. Morrison tipped his hat with mock politeness. His badge caught the morning sun, but his smile held no warmth. Behind him stood two men she recognized from the bank. Their presence made her stomach clench. "Mrs. Washington." Morrison's voice carried across the small room where her daughter Grace sat mending a torn dress. "Got some business to discuss." Grace's needle stopped moving. At 14, she had learned to read danger in men's voices. Her mother's protective instincts flared as she stepped between her daughter and the visitors. "What kind of business?" Morrison pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. The official seal of Cedar Ridge glinted red against the white document. "Eviction notice. You got 3 days to settle your back rent or vacate the premises." The words hit Verity like a physical blow. She had known this day might come, but hearing it spoken aloud made her legs feel weak. "How much do I owe?" $47. One of the bank men spoke up. His voice carried no sympathy. "Plus fees and interest makes it $62 total." $62 might as well have been $6,200. Verity's seamstress work brought in maybe $8 on a good month. Most families in town did their own mending rather than pay someone who looked like her. There might be another arrangement. Morrison's tone shifted, becoming almost conversational. "Mr. Cornelius Blackwood's son Marcus has taken quite a shine to your Grace here." Grace's sewing fell from her hands. Verity felt ice form in her chest despite the desert heat streaming through her windows. "Marcus is a fine young man with good prospects," Morrison continued as if discussing the weather. "He's expressed interest in making Grace his wife. Wedding would solve your debt problems real quick. Grace is 14 years old, legal marrying age in this territory. Marcus is only 19, good match for a girl in her position." Verity's mind raced. Marcus Blackwood had been watching Grace for months, following her to the well, cornering her after church services. Grace had come home twice with torn sleeves and frightened eyes. The boy had his father's cruel streak and his grandfather's sense of entitlement. "I need time to think. 3 days is all the time the law allows." Morrison folded the eviction notice and set it on her table. "But Marcus is eager. He'd like an answer by tomorrow evening." The men filed out, leaving Verity and Grace alone with the crushing weight of impossible choices. Grace picked up her sewing with trembling fingers, but Verity could see tears threatening to spill over. "Mama, I won't marry him." "You won't have to." Verity's voice carried more confidence than she felt. "I'll find another way." The rest of the morning blurred past as Verity made her rounds through town. Mrs. Peterson, at the general store, shook her head before Verity could finish asking about extra work. The hotel owner pretended not to hear her questions about laundry services. Even the church pastor, who preached about Christian charity every Sunday, suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere when she approached. By afternoon, the pattern had become clear. Word traveled fast in Cedar Ridge, and Cornelius Blackwood's influence reached into every corner of respectable society. No one would risk helping her if it meant crossing the man who controlled the bank, the largest ranch, and half the businesses in town. Grace met her at the cabin door as evening shadows stretched across their small yard. Her daughter's face had aged years in a single day. "Any luck, Mama?" Verity shook her head. She had $7.32 to her name. Even if she sold every piece of furniture they owned, every dress, every scrap of fabric, it wouldn't come close to $62. "There's one person I haven't asked yet." Grace raised her eyebrows. They had lived in Cedar Ridge for 3 years, ever since Verity's husband died. Grace knew every face in town as well as her mother did. Solomon Hartwell. The name hung between them like a prayer and a fear combined. Solomon Hartwell owned the largest ranch outside of town. He employed a dozen men and commanded respect even from Cornelius Blackwood. But he was also a white man with no reason to help a desperate widow and her daughter. "Will he listen to you?" "I don't know." Verity looked out their small window toward the rolling hills where Hartwell's cattle grazed. "But he's the only one Blackwood can't intimidate." That night, Verity lay awake planning words she had never imagined speaking. Tomorrow she would swallow every ounce of pride, walk onto Solomon Hartwell's ranch, and beg for salvation. The alternative was watching her daughter disappear into Marcus Blackwood's cruel hands. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Verity wondered if even the wild creatures knew that tomorrow would change everything. If you are enjoying this story of how one desperate plea will change two lives forever, don't forget to comment where you are tuning in from to show how this story can connect us across any distances, backgrounds, and hearts. Because what will happen in the next 15 minutes in Cedar Ridge will completely change everything Verity thought she knew about survival and unexpected alliances. Dawn broke cold over Cedar Ridge as Verity walked the dusty main street toward the edge of town. Her worn boots kicked up small clouds with each step. She had left Grace sleeping, unable to bear the hope she might see in her daughter's eyes. Solomon Hartwell's ranch stretched across the valley like a small kingdom. Cattle dotted the grassland, and the main house stood solid against the morning sky. Verity had never set foot on the property before. Few townspeople had reason to visit the man who kept largely to himself. She paused at the wooden gate, gathering courage she didn't feel. A ranch hand loading supplies onto a wagon glanced her way but said nothing. His expression held no hostility, just curious indifference. That alone marked Solomon's ranch as different from most places in Cedar Ridge. The main house door opened before she could knock. Solomon Hartwell stepped onto the porch, hat in hand, as if he had been expecting her. He was taller than she remembered from seeing him in town, with weathered features and gray threading through his dark hair. His clothes were simple but well-made, and his boots showed the wear of honest work. "Mrs. Washington." His voice carried no surprise. "You're out early." "Mr. Hartwell, I was hoping we could speak." He studied her face for a long moment. Something in his expression suggested he already knew why she had come. News traveled fast in small towns, especially news involving Sheriff Morrison and eviction notices. "Come up onto the porch. Sun's getting strong already." Verity climbed the wooden steps, noting how solid they felt under her feet. Everything about Solomon's property spoke of careful maintenance and quiet prosperity. She wondered what it felt like to build something lasting in a world that seemed designed to tear down anything beautiful. "I heard about your troubles." Solomon settled into a chair and gestured for her to take another. "Morrison's been making his rounds, has he?" "Yesterday. He gave me 3 days, and proposed Marcus Blackwood as a solution." The words held no question. Solomon already knew the whole ugly situation. Verity felt heat rise in her cheeks, but also a strange relief. She wouldn't have to explain the humiliating details. "My Grace won't marry that boy." "Good. Marcus Blackwood is trouble looking for a place to happen." Solomon leaned back in his chair. "What do you need from me?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She had prepared speeches about working to pay off a loan, about her skills as a seamstress and cook. But Solomon's straightforward manner stripped away all her careful words. "Money, $62 to clear the debt." "And then what?" You think Cornelius Blackwood will just let this end there? The question hit her like cold water. She had been so focused on the immediate crisis that she hadn't thought beyond clearing the eviction notice. But Solomon was right. Cornelius Blackwood didn't strike once and walk away. He would find other pressure points, other ways to force the outcome he wanted. I don't know. The admission tasted bitter, but I had to try something. Solomon stood and walked to the porch railing. His cattle moved slowly across the grassland, peaceful and protected within his boundaries. Verity envied them their safety. Cornelius has been sniffing around my property too. Solomon's voice carried a note she couldn't identify, asking questions about my family, my background, making suggestions about better uses for my land. He wants your ranch. He wants everything. Control over every acre, every business, every family in this territory. Solomon turned back toward her. Men like Cornelius don't stop until someone stops them. The conversation had taken a turn Verity hadn't expected. She had come seeking charity, but Solomon was talking about something larger, something that included both of them. I can work. She tried to steer back to safer ground. I'm good with numbers and I can manage a household. I could earn that $62 over time. You're missing the bigger picture, Mrs. Washington. Solomon's tone grew serious. This isn't about debt, it's about power. Cornelius wants your daughter married to his son because it gives him another piece of the puzzle, another family under his control. Then what do you suggest? Solomon was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, as if he was working through an idea even as he voiced it. Marriage changes a woman's legal status, gives her protections under territorial law that a widow doesn't have. Verity felt her breath catch. She wasn't sure if he was speaking generally or suggesting something specific. The silence stretched between them while she tried to read his expression. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that Cornelius Blackwood respects very few things in this world, but he respects legal marriage contracts and property rights. Solomon met her eyes directly, especially when those contracts involve someone he can't easily intimidate. The idea was so unexpected that Verity couldn't immediately process it. Marriage to Solomon Hartwell would solve the immediate crisis, but it would also change everything about her life and Grace's future. Why would you do that for strangers? Something flickered across Solomon's face. A memory or a pain she couldn't identify. Maybe we're not as different as this town likes to think. Before Verity could ask what he meant, hoofbeats sounded from the main road. 3 riders approached at a steady pace. Even from a distance, she recognized the lead horse and its arrogant rider. Marcus Blackwood had come calling, and he wasn't alone. Marcus Blackwood rode his black stallion like he owned every inch of ground beneath its hooves. His 2 companions flanked him on either side, their faces hard beneath their hat brims. They pulled up at Solomon's gate with theatrical precision, dust swirling around their horses' legs. Solomon stepped forward on his porch, positioning himself between the riders and Verity. The movement appeared casual, but she noticed how his hand rested near his belt. His ranch hands had stopped their work to watch the confrontation unfold. Marcus, Solomon's voice carried across the yard with calm authority. You're on my property. Just came to have a word with Mrs. Washington here. Marcus dismounted with exaggerated slowness. She seems to have gotten confused about certain arrangements. No confusion on my land. Mrs. Washington is my guest. Marcus stepped closer to the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was younger than Verity had realized, maybe 20 at most, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone much older. His father's influence had shaped him into something dangerous. Grace is expecting me for supper tonight. We got wedding plans to discuss. Grace is 14 years old. Verity found her voice despite the fear clawing at her throat. She's not marrying anyone. Legal age in this territory. My father checked with the territorial judge. Marcus smiled, but the expression held no warmth. Course, if her mama's got objections, we can always go back to the original plan. Eviction's still on the table. Solomon moved down one step. The gesture brought him closer to Marcus, but also made him appear even taller and more imposing. The ladies made her position clear. Time for you to respect it and move on. This doesn't concern you, Hartwell. Stay out of family business. Mrs. Washington is on my property discussing employment opportunities. That makes it my business. Marcus laughed, but the sound carried an edge of frustration. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not from Solomon Hartwell. Employment. What kind of work you offering a woman like her? The question hung in the air like poison. Verity felt heat rise in her cheeks, knowing exactly what Marcus was implying. But before she could respond, Solomon's voice cut through the tension. The kind that comes with legal protections. Mrs. Washington has agreed to become my wife. The words hit like lightning striking dry timber. Marcus's face went slack with shock. His companions exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to this development. Even Verity felt her world tilt on its axis, though Solomon had warned her this moment might come. Your wife, Marcus recovered quickly, but anger had replaced his earlier confidence. You can't be serious. Dead serious. We'll be married within the week. My father won't stand for this. He's got plans for that girl. Solomon descended the remaining steps until he stood at eye level with Marcus. The younger man was forced to look up slightly, a position that clearly rankled him. Your father's plans don't extend to my family. Grace Washington will be my stepdaughter soon enough. Any man who bothers her will answer to me. The threat was delivered quietly, but it carried absolute conviction. Marcus looked around at Solomon's ranch hands, all of whom had stopped pretending to work. They stood ready to back their employer if the situation turned violent. This isn't over. Marcus remounted his horse with jerky, angry movements. My father's not going to forget this insult. Tell your father he's welcome to discuss it with me anytime. I'll be right here. Marcus wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the gate. His companions followed, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of threats hanging in the morning air. Verity watched them disappear down the road before turning to face Solomon. Did you mean what you just said? Every word. Solomon climbed back up the porch steps. Question is, are you ready for what comes next? Verity looked out across the peaceful ranch, knowing that peace was about to shatter completely. Cornelius Blackwood would not accept this development quietly. He would bring every weapon in his arsenal to bear against both of them. What exactly are you asking of me? Partnership. Legal marriage for protection, but also genuine cooperation. I need someone I can trust, and you need someone who can stand up to the Blackwoods. And Grace. She'll have every opportunity I can provide. Education, safety, a real future instead of what Marcus had planned for her. The offer was more than Verity had dared hope for when she walked onto Solomon's property that morning. But it was also more complicated and dangerous than simply borrowing money to pay off a debt. Why are you willing to do this? You barely know us. Solomon was quiet for a moment, studying the horizon where Marcus and his men had disappeared. When he spoke, his voice carried old pain and fresh determination. Because some fights are worth having, and some people are worth protecting. Before Verity could respond, another rider appeared on the road. This time it was Sheriff Morrison, riding hard toward town with obvious urgency. Whatever news he carried, it would reach Cornelius Blackwood within the hour. Looks like word travels fast. Solomon straightened his shoulders. Are you ready to see this through? Verity thought of Grace back in their small cabin, probably wondering if her mother would return with hope or heartbreak. She thought of Marcus Blackwood's cold eyes and his father's ruthless ambition. Then she looked at Solomon Hartwell, this man who had offered partnership instead of charity, protection instead of pity. Yes, I'm ready. Solomon nodded once, as if her answer had settled something important in his mind. Then let's go tell Grace she's about to become part of a much larger family. The ride back to town passed in tense silence. Solomon had insisted on escorting Verity home, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. Grace met them at the cabin door, her eyes wide with questions she was afraid to ask. Mama, what happened? Verity looked at her daughter's face, then at Solomon standing quietly beside his horse. The next words would change their lives forever, but there was no turning back now. Mr. Hartwell has asked me to marry him. I've accepted. Grace's sewing basket tumbled from her hands. Thread spools rolled across the wooden floor as she stared at her mother in shock. Marry him, but you barely know each other. Sometimes circumstances don't allow for long courtships. Solomon stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. Your mother and I have made an arrangement that benefits both our families. What about Marcus Blackwood? He won't be bothering you anymore. You have my word on that. Grace looked between the two adults, processing the magnitude of what had just been decided. Her childhood had ended abruptly when her father died, and now it felt like even more was changing beyond her control. When? 3 days. Solomon's answer was matter of fact. We need to move quickly before the Blackwoods can organize any countermeasures. That evening, after Solomon had returned to his ranch, Verity sat with Grace by their small fireplace. The eviction notice lay crumpled on the table, suddenly irrelevant but still a reminder of how desperate their situation had been just hours earlier. Are you sure about this, Mama? Verity wasn't sure about anything, but uncertainty was a luxury she couldn't afford. Mr. Hartwell is a good man. He's offering us protection and a real future. But do you love him? The question struck at the heart of what made this arrangement so complicated. Verity had married for love once, and her husband's death had left her vulnerable to men like Cornelius Blackwood. This time she was choosing security over romance, survival over sentiment. Love can grow between people who respect each other. What matters now is that he's willing to stand up for our family when no one else will. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Pastor Williams arrived with his wife, both wearing expressions of concern mixed with curiosity. Behind them came Mrs. Peterson from the general store and 2 other women from the church committee. Verity, we heard the most surprising news. Mrs. Williams settled herself uninvited at the small kitchen table. Surely there's been some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Mr. Hartwell and I are to be married tomorrow evening. The women exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward with the predatory interest of someone hungry for gossip. But dear, you've known the man for all of a day. What could have prompted such a hasty decision? The same thing that prompted Marcus Blackwood to demand my 14-year-old daughter's hand in marriage. Desperation makes people act quickly. Pastor Williams cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Hartwell is a respected member of our community, but this situation is highly irregular. Perhaps we should postpone the ceremony until proper arrangements can be made. The arrangements are already proper. We have witnesses, legal consent, and your agreement to perform the service. What more does the law require? Well, nothing legally, but socially there are expectations. People will talk. People are already talking. Verity stood, indicating the visit was over. The question is whether they're talking about my daughter's wedding to Marcus Blackwood or my wedding to Solomon Hartwell. I know which conversation I prefer. The delegation left in a flutter of whispered conversations and meaningful looks. Grace watched from the window as they gathered in the street to continue their discussion. They think you're making a mistake. They think I'm forgetting my place. That's different. That afternoon, Solomon returned with surprising news. He carried a small wooden box and wore an expression of someone who had made an important decision. We need to have a private conversation before tomorrow evening. Grace excused herself to tend the small garden behind their cabin. Solomon waited until she was out of earshot before opening the wooden box. Inside lay a collection of documents, photographs, and papers that looked official and old. There are things about my family that most people in Cedar Ridge don't know. Verity studied the papers, recognizing military discharge documents and land deeds, but also seeing names and designations that surprised her. Solomon's full name was listed as Solomon Hartwell Running Bear, and his mother's maiden name was clearly Cherokee. Your grandmother was native. Cherokee. My grandfather was a freed slave who fought in the territorial wars. They met when his unit was stationed near the reservation. The revelation hit Verity like a physical blow. Solomon's light skin and European features had allowed him to pass in white society, but his heritage was more complex than anyone in town realized. Does anyone else know? A few old-timers who knew my family, but Cornelius Blackwood has been asking questions lately, digging into military records and territorial registrations. It's only a matter of time before he discovers the truth. And when he does, he'll use it to challenge my property rights, my business relationships, everything I've built. Solomon closed the box carefully. Unless I have legal protections he can't easily attack. The strategy became clear to Verity in that moment. Their marriage wasn't just about protecting her and Grace from the Blackwoods. It was about protecting Solomon as well. Two vulnerable families joining forces against a common enemy. You need me as much as I need you. More than you know. Your intelligence, your strength, your ability to see through people's motives. I've watched you handle impossible situations with grace and dignity. Those aren't common qualities. And if Cornelius discovers your background anyway, then we face it together. Two families united are harder to break than two families standing alone. That night, Verity lay awake considering the complexity of what she was entering. Tomorrow, she would marry a man who was not entirely what he seemed, for reasons that went far beyond her initial desperation. But for the first time in months, she felt something that had been missing from her life. Hope. Outside her window, Cedar Ridge slept uneasily, unaware that tomorrow would bring changes that would reshape the entire community's future. The wedding took place at sunset in Pastor William's small church. Only a handful of witnesses attended. Grace, two of Solomon's ranch hands, and Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house. The ceremony was brief and formal, with no music or flowers to mark the occasion. Verity wore her best dress, a dark blue cotton she had sewn herself 3 years earlier. Solomon appeared in a clean white shirt and dark jacket, his hair neatly combed and his manner respectfully solemn. They spoke their vows with quiet dignity, each understanding the gravity of their commitment. You may kiss the bride. Solomon's kiss was gentle and brief, sealing a contract that was part protection and part leap of faith. Grace wiped away tears she couldn't entirely explain, while the ranch hands nodded their approval of their boss's choice. The newlyweds rode back to Solomon's ranch as the stars began to appear overhead. Grace had packed their few belongings into 2 small bags, everything they owned fitting easily into Solomon's wagon. The transition from their cramped cabin to the spacious ranch house felt like stepping into someone else's life. Grace can have the room at the end of the hall. Solomon carried their bags inside while Verity looked around what was now her home. It gets good morning light for reading. The house was larger and better furnished than anywhere Verity had ever lived. Clean wooden floors, solid furniture, and real glass windows spoke of prosperity earned through hard work. But it was the books lining the shelves that caught her attention. You read a lot. Knowledge is the one thing no one can take away from you. Solomon noticed her examining the leather-bound volumes. Grace is welcome to any of them. Education will serve her better than anything else I can provide. The first week passed in careful adjustment. Grace threw herself into Solomon's extensive library, devouring books on history, mathematics, and territorial law. Her quick mind absorbed information like desert sand soaking up rare rainfall. Verity found her place in the ranch's daily operations with surprising ease. Solomon's previous housekeeper had left months earlier, and the men had been managing domestic duties poorly. But it was the business side of the ranch that revealed Verity's unexpected talents. These supply invoices don't match your receipts. She spread the papers across Solomon's desk on a Thursday morning. Johnson's charging you for 50 head of cattle feed, but only delivered 37. Solomon examined the documents, noting discrepancies he had missed entirely. How did you catch that? My father taught me numbers before he died. Said a woman who could count couldn't be cheated as easily. Verity's finger traced the columns of figures. Johnson's been shorting your orders for at least 6 months. That's nearly $200 in stolen feed. More than that, look at these veterinary supply bills. Same pattern. Solomon studied his new wife with growing respect. Her mathematical precision had uncovered systematic theft that his own bookkeeping had failed to detect. The discovery saved him money and revealed capabilities he hadn't expected. Would you be willing to handle the ranch accounts going forward, if you trust me with them? I'm beginning to think I'd be foolish not to. The business partnership developed naturally over the following days. Verity's sharp eye for detail complemented Solomon's knowledge of cattle and land management. She caught pricing errors, identified dishonest suppliers, and organized his chaotic filing system with methodical efficiency. But it was her ability to read people that proved most valuable. Don't buy cattle from Hendricks. She made the recommendation after watching Solomon negotiate with a livestock dealer. He's hiding something about those animals. What makes you say that? Watch his hands when he talks about their health. He touches his neck every time he mentions the veterinary certificates. That's a tell. Solomon had learned to trust Verity's instincts about human nature. Years of navigating prejudice had taught her to read subtle signs of deception and threat. When they investigated Hendrick's cattle more thoroughly, they discovered evidence of disease that would have cost Solomon his entire herd. Grace contributed to the family's success in her own way. Her literacy skills helped organize legal documents and correspondence that had been neglected for months. She copied contracts in her careful handwriting and maintained filing systems that made important papers easy to find. Grace has beautiful penmanship. Solomon examined a letter she had copied for him. Have you considered letting her help with the territorial correspondence? She's only 14. Age doesn't matter if she has the skills. The territorial government needs clerks and record keepers. Experience now could lead to real employment later. The suggestion opened new possibilities for Grace's future. Instead of facing marriage to Marcus Blackwood, she was developing skills that could provide independent income and social respect. But their growing success had not gone unnoticed. Cornelius Blackwood's influence extended into every corner of Cedar Ridge's business community, and Solomon's sudden improvement in operations had attracted unwanted attention. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley, who ran the feed store, arrived at the ranch with a nervous expression and unwelcome news. Solomon, I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but Cornelius has been asking questions about your family again. What kind of questions? Military records, land grants, territorial registrations from when your grandfather first settled here. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. He's got someone digging through old courthouse documents. Solomon exchanged glances with Verity. They had known this moment would come, but the reality still felt like a punch to the stomach. How long do we have? Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks, but Cornelius is determined to find something he can use against you. That evening, Solomon and Verity sat on their porch watching Grace practice her writing at the kitchen table. The peaceful scene felt precious and fragile, knowing it could be shattered by whatever Cornelius discovered. Are you ready for what comes next? Verity asked. Solomon looked out across his land, everything he had built and worked to protect. We'll face it together. That was the agreement. But both of them knew that Cornelius Blackwood's next move could destroy everything they had started to build. The territorial tax assessor arrived on a Tuesday morning with an air of official importance and a leather satchel full of documents. Henry Garrison wore a clean suit despite the dust of travel, and his manner suggested he took his government position very seriously. Solomon met him at the gate with careful politeness. Behind Garrison rode 2 assistants and a surveyor, more officials than typically accompanied routine tax assessments. The size of the delegation immediately raised Solomon's suspicions. Mr. Hartwell, I'm here to conduct a special assessment of your property for territorial tax purposes. Special assessment. My taxes are current. New territorial regulations require updated valuations on properties exceeding certain acreage limits. Garrison consulted his papers with theatrical precision. Your ranch qualifies for immediate reassessment. Verity emerged from the house carrying a tray of water for the visitors. Her presence was intended as courtesy, but she positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings. Something about Garrison's manner reminded her of Sheriff Morrison's false politeness. What kind of increase are we talking about? Solomon accepted the water glass, but kept his attention on the assessor. Hard to say until we complete our evaluation. Could be substantial. Land values have risen considerably in this territory. The team spread across Solomon's property with measuring tools and clipboards, documenting buildings, livestock counts, and acreage boundaries. Their thoroughness went far beyond normal tax assessment procedures. Verity watched from the porch, noting how they paid particular attention to property boundary markers and land deed references. Grace, bring me the metal box from the bedroom closet. Verity sent her daughter on an errand that would keep her safely inside. The one with Papa Solomon's important papers. Solomon glanced toward his wife, recognizing the strategic thinking behind her request. If this assessment was connected to Cornelius Blackwood's investigation, they needed to have their legal documents readily available. Mrs. Hartwell, I presume. Garrison approached the porch with studied courtesy. I understand you're newly married. 3 weeks ago. Congratulations. Marriage changes certain legal considerations regarding property ownership. I trust all the documentation is properly filed. The question carried implications beyond simple curiosity. Verity met his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated by his official authority. Our marriage certificate is registered with the territorial clerk. Everything is entirely legal. Of course. Though I notice some irregularities in the historical land grants for this property. Questions about original ownership and inheritance rights. Solomon joined them on the porch, his expression carefully neutral. What kind of irregularities? Conflicting records about tribal land cessions and military grants. Some documentation appears to be missing from the territorial archives. Verity felt ice form in her stomach. Missing documentation was rarely accidental, especially when it involved properties that powerful men wanted to acquire. Cornelius Blackwood's influence extended into territorial government offices. I have copies of all original documents. Solomon's voice remained steady. My grandfather kept meticulous records. Copies are helpful, but original territorial filings carry more legal weight, especially when questions arise about eligibility for land grants. The threat was delivered with bureaucratic politeness, but its meaning was clear. Someone was challenging the legal basis of Solomon's property ownership, and missing government records would make defending his claim much more difficult. Grace returned with the document box, her young face reflecting the tension she sensed in the adult conversation. Verity took the box and began organizing papers with systematic efficiency. Here are the original land grants from 1847. She handed Solomon documents that proved his grandfather's military service and legal right to territorial homestead claims, and the inheritance documentation when the property passed to you. Garrison examined the papers with professional interest, but Verity noticed how his eyes lingered on certain details. He was looking for specific information, not conducting a general review. These military service records indicate your grandfather served with the 3rd Territorial Infantry. Interesting unit composition during that period. The comment seemed casual, but Solomon recognized the fishing expedition behind it. The 3rd Territorial Infantry had been one of the integrated units, including Native Americans, freed slaves, and European immigrants. Garrison was probing for racial background information. My grandfather served with distinction. His commanding officer's recommendations are included in those documents. Yes, I see that. Though unit records from that period can be incomplete, sometimes additional research is necessary to verify eligibility for land grants. Verity stepped forward with a folder she had prepared while Solomon talked with Garrison. Her mathematical training had taught her to organize information logically and present it persuasively. These are certified copies of all territorial filings, cross-referenced with congressional land allocation records and military pension documentation. She handed Garrison a meticulously organized summary. Everything is documented and verifiable through multiple government sources. Garrison examined Verity's work with surprise. Her presentation was more thorough and professional than many legal briefs he had reviewed. The organization and attention to detail suggested someone with significant administrative experience. "You're quite thorough, Mrs. Hartwell. My father taught me the importance of proper record keeping, especially when dealing with government officials." The subtle emphasis on government officials carried its own message. Verity was indicating she understood the political nature of this assessment and was prepared to defend her family's interests. "Well, everything appears to be in order for now." Garrison folded his papers and signaled his assistants to finish their work. "Though I should mention that reassessment could result in tax increases of $300 to $400 annually." The amount was staggering, clearly designed to force a sale rather than collect legitimate taxes. Solomon's ranch generated good income, but $400 in additional taxes would create serious financial strain. When would these new taxes take effect? Immediately upon final assessment. Payment would be due within 60 days. Garrison and his team departed with the same official ceremony they had brought to their arrival, but they left behind a new crisis that threatened everything Solomon and Verity had built together. "He's working for Cornelius." Grace spoke the obvious truth once the officials were out of hearing range. "Probably." Solomon gathered the scattered documents from their impromptu legal defense. "But we held them off for now." Verity stared down the road where the assessors had disappeared, her mind already working on strategies for the larger battle ahead. They had won this skirmish through preparation and legal knowledge, but Cornelius Blackwood would return with heavier weapons. This is just the beginning. 2 weeks after the tax assessor's visit, Sheriff Morrison returned to Solomon's ranch with different news. This time he came alone, his usual swagger replaced by something resembling genuine concern. He dismounted slowly, like a man carrying unwelcome information. "Solomon, we need to talk." "About what?" "Cornelius Blackwood's been making inquiries, official ones." Morrison removed his hat and ran fingers through his graying hair. "He's got documentation about your family background, military records from the territorial archives." The words hit like hammer blows despite Solomon's preparation for this moment. Verity emerged from the house, Grace close behind her. All three understood that their carefully built life was about to face its greatest test. "What kind of documentation?" "Birth certificates, marriage records, military enlistment papers going back to your grandfather's time." Morrison's voice carried reluctant sympathy. "Information that could complicate your property ownership." Solomon felt decades of careful discretion crumbling around him. His mixed heritage had been an open secret among older residents, but official documentation would give Cornelius legal weapons to attack everything he had built. "What does he want?" "Meeting tonight. His office. Says you can bring your lawyer if you got one." "And if I refuse?" Morrison shrugged helplessly. "Then he files challenges to your land grants tomorrow morning. Claims your grandfather wasn't eligible for military homestead rights." After Morrison left, the family gathered around their kitchen table with maps, legal documents, and the growing weight of impossible choices. Solomon spread territorial surveys across the wooden surface, while Verity organized correspondence with methodical precision. "He's been planning this for months." Verity traced property boundaries with her finger. "The tax assessment, the missing archives, now the ultimatum. Everything's been coordinated. What are our options?" "Fight it in territorial court. Hope the judge values legal precedent over political pressure." Solomon's voice carried little optimism. "Or give him what he wants and try to salvage something." Grace looked up from the law book she had been studying. At 15, she understood legal concepts that would challenge most adults. What about counter-strategies? Are there things he doesn't want exposed? The question sparked something in Verity's mind. She had been thinking defensively, trying to protect what they had built. But Grace's suggestion opened different possibilities. We need to research Cornelius's own property claims, see if his titles are as clean as he pretends. Where would we find that information? Territorial Land Office in Silver Creek. 3 days ride, but they keep duplicate records of all major transactions. Solomon considered the proposal. Traveling to Silver Creek would mean leaving the ranch vulnerable, but it might also provide ammunition for their own legal fight. Too dangerous for me to go. Cornelius will be watching my movements. Then I'll go. Verity's declaration surprised both Solomon and Grace. I can research property records as well as anyone. Better than most, actually. Absolutely not. It's too risky. More risky than letting Cornelius destroy us without fighting back. Verity's tone brooked no argument. Besides, nobody expects a woman to be conducting legal research. I'll be invisible. That evening, Solomon rode into town for his confrontation with Cornelius Blackwood. The banker's office occupied the most prominent building on Main Street, its windows glowing with lamplight as darkness settled over Cedar Ridge. Cornelius sat behind a massive oak desk like a judge preparing to deliver sentence. Documents covered the desktop in neat stacks, each pile representing another aspect of his campaign against Solomon's family. Sit down, Solomon, or should I say, Solomon Running Bear. The use of his full name confirmed Solomon's worst fears. Cornelius had obtained complete military records, including tribal designations and family heritage documentation. What do you want, Cornelius? What I've always wanted, your ranch. But now I'm prepared to offer more generous terms than simple purchase. Cornelius slid a contract across the desk. The terms were brutal but not entirely unreasonable. Solomon would retain a small portion of his land in exchange for surrendering the majority of his holdings. And if I refuse, then tomorrow I file legal challenges to every aspect of your property ownership. Your grandfather's eligibility for military land grants, your inheritance rights under territorial law, your marriage license, which might be invalid if your racial status was misrepresented. The threat to his marriage struck deepest. Solomon had found genuine partnership with Verity, something worth protecting beyond mere property rights. You have 24 hours to decide. While Solomon faced ultimatums in town, Verity prepared for her journey to Silver Creek. Grace helped pack research materials and traveling supplies, both women understanding the critical importance of their mission. What exactly are you looking for, Mama? Irregularities, inconsistencies, anything that suggests Cornelius's own property claims might not be legitimate. Verity folded territorial maps into her saddlebags. Men who break rules to get what they want usually have something to hide. And if you find evidence, then we have leverage for our own negotiations. Verity departed before dawn, riding Solomon's most reliable horse towards Silver Creek. The Territorial Land Office opened at 8 o'clock, and she wanted to begin research as early as possible. The records office was managed by a clerk named Patterson, an elderly man who took pride in his meticulous filing systems. He viewed Verity's research request with mild curiosity but no suspicion. Property records for Cedar Ridge Territory, certainly. Are you researching a specific claim? Several claims. I'm helping my husband with some business matters. Patterson led her to a room filled with filing cabinets and document boxes. The territorial records stretched back 30 years, chronicling every major land transaction in the region. Verity began with Cornelius Blackwood's earliest property acquisitions, noting dates, prices, and previous owners. Her mathematical training helped her identify patterns and discrepancies that might escape casual review. By afternoon, she had discovered something interesting. 3 of Cornelius's most valuable properties had been acquired through tax default sales, but the original owners had been given inadequate notice of their tax obligations. More importantly, 2 properties showed evidence of forged documentation and backdated land transfers that violated territorial regulations. Cornelius Blackwood had built his empire through systematic fraud, and now Verity had proof. As evening approached, she carefully copied the most damaging documents and prepared for the long ride home. Tomorrow would bring the most important confrontation of their lives, but now they had weapons of their own. Verity rode through the night, pushing Solomon's mare harder than she normally would. The copied documents tucked inside her jacket represented more than evidence of Cornelius Blackwood's fraud. They were the key to understanding how deep his corruption ran and how many families had suffered for his greed. She reached the ranch as dawn painted the eastern hills gold and red. Solomon met her at the gate, his face drawn with worry and exhaustion. Behind him, Grace waited on the porch with obvious anxiety. "Did you find anything?" "More than I hoped." Verity dismounted stiffly, her body aching from the hard ride. "Cornelius has been stealing land for over a decade." They gathered around the kitchen table while Verity spread her discoveries across the wooden surface. The documents told a story of systematic theft disguised as legitimate business transactions. "Look at this." She pointed to a property deed dated 3 years earlier. The Morrison family farm. Cornelius claimed they owed back taxes, but the territorial records show their payments were current. Solomon studied the papers with growing amazement. How did he get away with it? Forged tax notices, backdated default judgments. Sheriff Morrison was probably involved in most of it. Verity's finger traced a pattern of similar transactions. At least 8 families lost their land through fraudulent tax sales. Grace leaned over the documents, her young mind quickly grasping the implications. If you can prove the fraud, couldn't those families get their land back? Theoretically, but it would require territorial court action and evidence that Cornelius hasn't had time to destroy. Verity's voice carried both hope and caution. The bigger question is whether we can use this information to protect ourselves. Solomon was quiet for a long moment, processing what his wife had discovered. The evidence was damning, but using it would mean escalating their conflict with Cornelius into open warfare. "There's something else." Verity produced another set of documents from her jacket. "Your ranch isn't the only property he's trying to acquire through legal challenges." The papers showed that Cornelius had filed similar heritage-based claims against 3 other landowners in the territory. His strategy was systematic, targeting anyone whose racial background could be questioned under territorial law. "He's not just coming after us. He's trying to steal half the land in this territory. Which means we're not fighting this alone." Solomon's tone shifted as he recognized the broader implications. "If we can prove his pattern of fraud, we might have allies we didn't know existed." Grace had been studying the territorial maps while her parents examined legal documents. Her education in history and geography suddenly proved valuable in ways none of them had anticipated. "Mama, look at this property boundary." She pointed to a section of land adjacent to Solomon's ranch. According to this survey, the Morrison family farm extended much further east than anyone realized. Verity followed Grace's reasoning, her mathematical mind quickly grasping the significance. If the Morrisons' original boundaries were accurate, then part of Cornelius's current holdings are actually stolen property. Not just stolen, never legally his to begin with. Solomon traced the property lines with growing excitement, which means his challenges to our land rights are coming from someone who doesn't have clean title to his own property. The discovery transformed their strategic position completely. Instead of defending against Cornelius's attacks, they could launch their own legal offensive using evidence of his systematic fraud. "We need to move fast." Verity began organizing the documents into categories. "If Cornelius realizes what we found, he'll destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses." "What do you suggest?" "Public confrontation. Force him to defend his own property claims in front of witnesses who can't be bought or intimidated." Solomon considered the proposal. Public confrontation was risky, but it would also prevent Cornelius from using his usual tactics of private pressure and legal manipulation. The Harvest Festival is next week. Territorial Judge will be here for the annual court session. Perfect timing. We present our evidence when he can't control the audience or the outcome. Grace looked between her parents with mixture of pride and concern. In the space of a month, she had watched her mother transform from desperate widow to strategic legal mind, capable of challenging the most powerful man in the territory. What if he tries to stop us before then? Then we make sure everyone knows why. Verity's voice carried new confidence born from having weapons instead of just hope. Corruption works in darkness. Shine light on it, and it withers. They spent the rest of the day preparing their case like lawyers getting ready for the most important trial of their careers. Solomon provided historical context about land grants and territorial law. Verity organized evidence with mathematical precision. Grace copied documents in her careful handwriting, creating backups in case their originals were stolen or destroyed. By evening, they had assembled a comprehensive case that documented not just Cornelius's fraud, but its impact on multiple families throughout the territory. The scope of his corruption was breathtaking in its audacity and devastating in its consequences. "Are we really going to do this?" Grace asked as they finished their preparations. "We don't have a choice." Solomon looked at his stepdaughter with obvious affection. "But if we succeed, we'll have changed things for a lot of families besides our own." That night, Verity lay awake listening to the sounds of their peaceful ranch while considering the magnitude of what they were planning. Tomorrow would begin the most dangerous week of their lives, but it would also determine whether justice was possible in a territory controlled by men like Cornelius Blackwood. Outside her window, an owl called across the grassland, and Verity took it as a good omen. Even in darkness, some creatures saw clearly enough to hunt successfully. She intended to follow their example. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the weight of decisions that could not be undone. The battle for their future would begin in 6 days, and Verity Washington Hartwell was ready to fight for everything that mattered. The morning brought unexpected visitors to Solomon's ranch. 3 families arrived within an hour of each other, all carrying similar stories of loss and similar hopes for justice. Word had spread quietly through the territory that someone was finally prepared to challenge Cornelius Blackwood's empire. James Morrison led the first group, accompanied by his wife and 2 teenage sons. The Morrison family had lost their farm 2 years earlier through what they had believed was legitimate tax foreclosure. Verity's research had revealed the fraud behind their dispossession. "Mrs. Hartwell, Tom Bradley said you found evidence about our property." Verity spread the Morrison family documents across her kitchen table, showing them the forged tax notices and backdated legal filings that had cost them their livelihood. "Your farm was stolen. The tax default was fabricated using false documentation." Mrs. Morrison covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the confirmation of what she had suspected but could never prove. Her husband studied the papers with growing anger and determination. "Can we get our land back? If we can prove the fraud in territorial court, yes." Solomon joined the conversation, his voice carrying cautious optimism. "But it means fighting Cornelius publicly and accepting the risks that come with that fight." The second family was the Hendersons, an elderly couple who had lost their small ranch through similar fraudulent tax proceedings. Their adult son had ridden over from Silver Creek where he worked as a telegraph operator. "We ain't got much left to lose." Old Pete Henderson's voice shook with rage. "Cornelius took everything we built in 40 years. If there's a chance to get some of it back, we're willing to fight." The third group surprised everyone. The Yazzie family had traveled from the Cherokee Reservation, led by an elderly man named Joseph Yazzie who walked with quiet dignity despite his advanced years. "I knew your grandfather," Joseph addressed Solomon directly. "Thomas Running Bear was a good man who served this territory with honor. You knew him. We served together in the territorial militia. He saved my life during the Apache raids of 1851. Joseph's weathered face carried the weight of old memories. When I heard Cornelius was questioning his land rights, I came to offer testimony about his military service. The gathering transformed into an impromptu war council as more families arrived throughout the day. Each brought stories of Cornelius's corruption, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic theft that had impoverished dozens of honest families. Grace moved among the visitors with quiet efficiency, taking notes and organizing testimony with the precision of a professional court clerk. Her education was proving invaluable in ways no one had anticipated. "How many families has he stolen from?" she asked her mother during a brief break in the testimonials. "At least 12 that we can document, probably twice that many if we had time to research further." Verity looked around the crowded house with mixture of hope and apprehension. "The question is whether we can present a coherent case before he realizes what we're planning." By evening, they had assembled a coalition of wronged families willing to testify publicly about Cornelius's fraudulent practices. More importantly, they had Joseph Yazzi's first-hand testimony about Solomon's grandfather's legitimate military service and legal right to territorial land grants. "The harvest festival is in 3 days." Solomon addressed the assembled group from his front porch. "Judge Harrison will be conducting territorial court sessions. We present our evidence then in front of the whole community. What if Cornelius tries to stop us beforehand? Then we make sure our evidence survives even if we don't." Verity held up copies of documents she had prepared throughout the day. "Multiple families have copies of everything. The truth can't be suppressed if enough people know it." The families departed as darkness fell, each carrying hope they hadn't felt in years and evidence that could restore their stolen property. But they also carried the weight of knowing that Cornelius Blackwood would not surrender his empire without a vicious fight. Solomon and Verity spent the evening rehearsing their presentation, anticipating questions and objections that Judge Harrison might raise. Grace helped by role-playing as hostile witnesses and skeptical officials. "What if the judge is corrupt too? Judge Harrison has a reputation for honesty, but even honest judges can be pressured." Solomon's expression was grim. "That's why we need public testimony. Harder to ignore justice when the whole community is watching. And if we lose, then at least we fought back instead of surrendering without a battle." The next morning brought disturbing news from town. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the ranch with information that confirmed their worst fears about Cornelius's desperation. "He knows you've been gathering evidence. Someone saw you at the Silver Creek land office." Morrison's usual bluster was replaced by genuine concern. "He's talking about having you arrested for theft of government documents. I copied public records that any citizen has the right to examine. Since when does Cornelius care about legal technicalities? He's got Judge Wilson coming down from the territorial capital to supersede Harrison's authority." The news hit like a physical blow. Judge Wilson was notorious for favoring wealthy landowners over common settlers, and his presence would eliminate their chance for fair hearing. "When does Wilson arrive?" "Tomorrow morning." Cornelius moved the court session up 2 days. Verity felt their carefully planned strategy crumbling. They had prepared for a public confrontation during the harvest festival when the entire community would witness the proceedings. A private session with a corrupt judge would allow Cornelius to control both the audience and the outcome. "Unless we present our case before Wilson gets here." Solomon stared at his wife with growing understanding. "Tonight, during the harvest dance. The whole town will be there, including families we can't reach any other way." Verity's mind was already working through the logistics. "If we present our evidence publicly, Wilson won't be able to ignore it without looking obviously corrupt. That's dangerous territory. Cornelius won't hesitate to use violence if he feels cornered. More dangerous than letting him steal everything without fighting back." Grace looked between her parents, recognizing the moment when everything would change irrevocably. "What do you need me to do?" Solomon put his arm around his stepdaughter's shoulders, pride and concern warring in his expression. "Help us get ready to change the world." As afternoon faded into evening, the Hartwell family prepared for the confrontation that would determine not just their own future, but the future of justice in the entire territory. The harvest dance would become a trial, and they intended to make sure the verdict favored truth over corruption. The Harvest Festival filled Cedar Ridge's main street with lanterns, music, and the largest crowd the town had seen all year. Families from across the territory had gathered for the annual celebration, creating the perfect audience for what was about to unfold. Judge Harrison sat at the honored table near the makeshift stage, unaware that his evening was about to become a courtroom drama. Verity moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, carrying a leather satchel that contained months of careful research. Grace walked beside her, both women dressed in their finest clothes as if attending a social gathering rather than preparing for legal warfare. Solomon positioned himself near the stage where the evening speeches would take place. Cornelius Blackwood held court at the center of the festivities, surrounded by business associates and territorial officials who had traveled from the capital. He wore his prosperity like armor, confident that his world remained secure and his enemies remained powerless. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." Mayor Patterson stepped onto the wooden platform that served as both dance floor and speaking stage. "Judge Harrison would like to say a few words before we begin the evening's festivities." Judge Harrison was a lean man in his 60s, with the careful bearing of someone who had spent decades weighing evidence and delivering verdicts. He approached the podium with judicial dignity, expecting to deliver routine remarks about territorial progress and community values. "Friends and neighbors, it's always a pleasure to visit Cedar Ridge during your harvest celebration. This territory has prospered through the hard work and honest dealings of families like those gathered here tonight." Verity stepped forward from the crowd, her movement drawing attention from both the judge and the assembled townspeople. Her presence at the front of the gathering was unexpected but not yet alarming. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I have urgent legal matters that require your attention." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Social protocol dictated that legal business be conducted during formal court sessions, not at community celebrations. But something in Verity's manner suggested this was far from a social breach of etiquette. "Mrs. Hartwell, isn't it? Perhaps we could discuss this during tomorrow's court session." "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Your Honor. Judge Wilson is arriving tomorrow to supersede your authority in matters involving land disputes." The announcement created immediate tension. Judge Harrison's expression shifted from polite confusion to sharp attention. He had not been informed of Wilson's arrival or the superseding of his jurisdiction. Cornelius Blackwood pushed through the crowd toward the stage, his face darkening with anger. "This is highly inappropriate. Mrs. Hartwell has no standing to address territorial legal matters." "Actually, she does." Solomon stepped forward with documents that established Verity's legal right to represent property interests as his wife. "These matters directly affect our family's land holdings and the holdings of several other families present tonight." Grace moved to a position near the stage where she could take notes and provide documentary support. Her presence added legitimacy to the proceedings while also ensuring that multiple witnesses could testify to everything that was about to be revealed. "Your Honor, I have evidence of systematic fraud in territorial land transactions dating back over 10 years. Verity's voice carried across the crowd with clear authority. "Evidence that affects the legal ownership of dozens of properties in this territory." The crowd fell silent as the magnitude of her accusation became clear. Property ownership was the foundation of territorial society, and fraud on the scale Verity was suggesting would affect nearly every family present. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hartwell. Do you have documentation to support such claims?" Verity opened her satchel and produced the first set of documents she had copied from the Silver Creek Land Office. Forged tax default notices, backdated legal judgments, fabricated debt assessments used to justify property seizures. She handed the papers to Judge Harrison while Grace distributed copies to families in the crowd. The Morrison family recognized their own forged documents, while the Henderson family saw evidence of the fraud that had cost them their ranch. These documents show that the Morrison family farm was seized through fabricated tax defaults. Their actual tax payments were current, but false notices were created to justify foreclosure proceedings. James Morrison stepped forward with his wife beside him. "That's our property deed, Your Honor. We were told we owed back taxes we had already paid." More families began recognizing their own stolen properties in Verity's evidence. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as the scope of the fraud became apparent. Cornelius Blackwood climbed onto the stage, his usual composure cracking under the pressure of public exposure. "This is a coordinated attack on legitimate business transactions. These people are trying to reverse legal property transfers through false accusations. Then you won't mind if Judge Harrison examines the original territorial records to verify the authenticity of these documents." Verity's tone was calm but implacable. "Unless, of course, you've already destroyed the evidence." The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Judge Harrison studied the documents with growing amazement while the crowd waited for Cornelius's response. "Furthermore," Verity continued, "we have testimony from Joseph Yazzie regarding Solomon's grandfather's military service and legitimate right to territorial land grants." Joseph Yazzie stepped forward with the dignity of his Cherokee heritage and the authority of his military service. His presence added moral weight to the legal evidence. "Thomas Running Bear saved my life in 1851. He earned his land through honorable service to this territory." The combination of documentary evidence and personal testimony created an overwhelming case against Cornelius's empire. Judge Harrison looked around the crowd, seeing families whose lives had been destroyed by systematic fraud. "Mr. Blackwood, these are serious accusations with substantial supporting evidence. How do you respond?" Cornelius's face had gone pale as he realized his carefully constructed world was collapsing in front of the entire community. "I demand a formal hearing with proper legal representation." "You'll have one." Judge Harrison's voice carried the authority of territorial law. "But based on this evidence, I'm issuing immediate injunctions against any further property transfers pending full investigation." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as families realized they might finally have justice for years of theft and corruption. Verity Washington Hartwell had transformed from desperate widow to the woman who brought down the territory's most powerful criminal. But she knew the real battle was just beginning. The weeks following the Harvest Festival transformed Cedar Ridge beyond recognition. Judge Harrison's formal investigation confirmed every accusation Verity had made, leading to criminal charges against Cornelius Blackwood and the overturning of dozens of fraudulent property seizures. Verity found herself at the center of the territory's legal revolution, her mathematical precision and organizational skills making her invaluable to families seeking to reclaim stolen land. The woman who had once begged for help now sat in the territorial courthouse, advising judges on complex property disputes. "Mrs. Hartwell, we need your analysis of the Patterson Ranch boundaries." Judge Harrison consulted notes from another restitution case. "The original surveys don't match Blackwood's filed documentation." Verity spread territorial maps across the courthouse table, her finger tracing property lines with the confidence of someone who had become the territory's unofficial expert on land fraud. The Patterson family's original grant included an additional 40 acres on the eastern boundary. Cornelius altered the survey markers to reduce their holdings. Grace sat beside her mother, copying legal decisions and organizing case files with professional competence. The 15-year-old had become the courthouse's most reliable clerk, her education and attention to detail surpassing many adult officials. "How many families are we helping now?" Grace asked during a brief break between hearings. 17 families have reclaimed their properties completely, Another dozen are in various stages of the process. Verity looked around the bustling courthouse with satisfaction, plus the Cherokee families who are getting their ancestral lands back through Joseph's testimony. Solomon had emerged from hiding his mixed heritage to become a respected voice in territorial affairs. His military background and successful ranch management gave him credibility with officials who had previously dismissed him as just another settler. The territorial legislature wants to appoint you as official land fraud investigator. Solomon joined his wife and stepdaughter at their courthouse workspace. Full salary and government authority to examine property records throughout the territory. The offer represented everything Verity had never dared dream possible. From desperate widow to territorial official in less than 6 months, her transformation had become legend throughout the region. And leave the ranch, keep the ranch and expand your influence. They want to establish a regional office in Cedar Ridge with you in charge. Verity considered the implications. Official appointment would give her resources to help families across multiple territories, but it would also mean taking on powerful enemies beyond Cornelius Blackwood. What about Cornelius? Is he really finished? Prison sentence of 12 years for fraud and corruption. Most of his properties are being redistributed to families he stole from. Solomon's tone carried grim satisfaction. Sheriff Morrison got 5 years as an accomplice. The Blackwood Empire had collapsed completely once its criminal foundation was exposed. Marcus Blackwood had fled the territory rather than face charges related to his father's schemes, leaving behind debts and legal troubles that would take years to resolve. The Morrison family wants to name their new barn after you. Grace shared news from their grateful allies. Mrs. Henderson is teaching other women your bookkeeping methods. The ripple effects of Verity's courage continued spreading throughout the territory. Women who had never been allowed to handle business matters were learning mathematical skills and legal procedures, creating a generation of informed advocates for their family's interests. There's something else. Solomon's expression grew serious. Territorial Governor Mills wants to meet with you next month. He's considering legislation to prevent this kind of fraud from happening in other territories. The scope of Verity's influence had grown beyond anything she could have imagined when she first approached Solomon's ranch with her desperate plea. Her work was reshaping not just Cedar Ridge, but territorial policy across the entire region. Judge Harrison approached their table with another family's case files. The Rodriguez family had lost their small farm through tax manipulation, similar to Cornelius's other schemes. Mrs. Hartwell, this case involves Spanish land grants from before territorial status. The legal precedents are complex. Verity accepted the documents with confidence born from months of successful advocacy. Spanish grants follow different procedures, but the fraud patterns are the same. Give me 2 days to research the territorial conversion laws. As Judge Harrison departed, Verity reflected on how completely her life had changed. The woman who had once sewn dresses for spare change now influenced territorial legislation and advised government officials on complex legal matters. "Are you happy, Mama?" Grace asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Verity looked around the courthouse where families waited hopefully for justice, then at Solomon, whose partnership had made everything possible, and finally at Grace, whose future now included opportunities that had been unimaginable months earlier. Happy isn't the right word. Purposeful maybe. Useful. She organized the Spanish grant documents with practiced efficiency. "I'm helping families who were in the same desperate situation we faced. That feels important. And the marriage, are you happy about that?" Verity glanced at Solomon, who was discussing cattle prices with a rancher whose property had been restored through their investigations. What had begun as a strategic alliance had deepened into genuine affection and respect. "Your stepfather is a good man who became a true partner. We built something together that neither of us could have accomplished alone." That evening, the Hartwell family sat on their ranch porch watching sunset paint the grassland gold and crimson. Their cattle grazed peacefully across acres that were legally secure for the first time in years. Mrs. Patterson asked me to tutor her daughters in mathematics and reading. Grace shared her own expanding opportunities. She says educated women are the territory's future. Solomon nodded approvingly. Education and justice go together. What you and your mother have accomplished proves that intelligence and courage can overcome any disadvantage. Verity watched her daughter and husband discuss plans for establishing a school in Cedar Ridge, marveling at how a moment of desperation had created possibilities none of them had dreamed possible. Tomorrow would bring new families seeking help, new cases of fraud to investigate, and new opportunities to build a more just society. But tonight, she was content to sit with her family and savor the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. 3 years had passed since the desperate morning when Verity Washington had approached Solomon Hartwell's ranch with nothing but hope and determination. Now, she stood on the front porch of what had become the most respected property in Cedar Ridge territory, watching her world with the satisfaction of someone who had fought for every blessing she possessed. The ranch had expanded to include the Morrison family's restored farm and 2 other properties that grateful families had sold to Solomon at fair prices. What had once been a single man's isolated holding had become a thriving community of interconnected ranches managed with Verity's mathematical precision and Solomon's agricultural expertise. Grace emerged from the main house carrying law books and correspondence from the territorial capital. At 18, she had become the youngest certified legal clerk in territorial history, her education and natural intelligence opening doors that would have been impossible just years earlier. The Patterson family case was approved by the territorial court. Grace set her papers on the porch table beside her mother's morning coffee. That's 47 families who have reclaimed stolen property through our investigations. Verity reviewed the legal decision with professional satisfaction. Her appointment as territorial land fraud investigator had given her resources to help families across 3 different territories, making her one of the most influential officials in the region. And the school funding, approved by the territorial legislature. Cedar Ridge will have the first integrated school in this part of the territory, with facilities for children regardless of background or family heritage. The school project represented everything Verity had learned about building lasting change. Instead of simply fighting individual cases of injustice, she was creating institutions that would prevent future problems while providing opportunities for the next generation. Solomon approached from the pasture where he had been checking cattle with his expanded crew of ranch hands. The operation now employed 12 men and provided steady income for families throughout the area. His success had become a model for other ranchers who wanted to build prosperity through honest dealing rather than exploitation. The Yazzie family sent word from the reservation. Joseph wants to speak at the school dedication ceremony next month. The friendship between Solomon and the Cherokee elder had deepened over the years, creating bridges between communities that had often been isolated from each other. Joseph's testimony had not only protected Solomon's property rights, but had also established legal precedents that protected other mixed-heritage families throughout the territory. What about the new families from Kansas? Are they settling in well? Better than expected. The Williams family has already started clearing land for crops, and the Johnson family is interested in joining our cattle cooperative. Cedar Ridge had become a destination for families seeking opportunity and justice, its reputation spreading through networks of former residents who had found prosperity and security under the community's new values. What Cornelius Blackwood had tried to control through fear and fraud was now thriving through cooperation and honest dealing. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the approach of another family seeking help. Verity recognized the pattern. A wagon loaded with possessions, adults with determined expressions, children peering hopefully at their potential new home. Looks like the Fletcher family from Colorado Territory. Grace consulted her correspondence files. They lost their farm to fraudulent debt collection, Mrs. Fletcher wrote asking about land available for purchase. Verity walked down from the porch to meet the approaching wagon, her movement automatic after years of welcoming displaced families. She had learned that the first moments of contact often determined whether desperate people would find hope or give up entirely. "Mrs. Fletcher, I'm Verity Hartwell. We've been expecting you." Sarah Fletcher climbed down from the wagon seat with the careful movements of someone who had traveled far and endured much. Her 3 children stayed close to their parents, uncertainty and hope warring in their young faces. "Mrs. Hartwell, your letter said you might have work available for my husband and land we could afford to purchase." "Both, actually. My husband needs experienced farmers for our expanded operations, and we have several properties available at fair prices with reasonable payment terms." The conversation continued as more families appeared on the horizon. Word had spread throughout surrounding territories that Cedar Ridge offered genuine opportunity for hardworking families, regardless of their background or previous misfortunes. Grace joined the discussion with maps and legal documents, her professional competence impressive to families who had been cheated by smooth-talking land speculators in other territories. Solomon provided practical information about soil conditions, water rights, and marketing opportunities for crops and livestock. "The children can start school immediately." Verity addressed the educational opportunities that often concerned parents most. "Our teacher is preparing lessons in mathematics, reading, territorial law, and practical skills that will serve them well regardless of their future plans." By evening, the Fletcher family had agreed to purchase 40 acres adjacent to the Hartwell Ranch, with Tom Fletcher accepting employment that would provide immediate income while they established their own farming operation. The children had already made friends with other recent arrivals, creating the connections that would integrate them into the community. As sunset painted the grassland in shades of gold and crimson, Verity stood on her porch surveying everything she and Solomon had built together. Their strategic marriage had become a genuine partnership that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of dozens of families throughout the territory. "Any regrets, Mama?" Grace asked as they watched the newest families setting up temporary camps before beginning their permanent settlements. "Only that it took so long to discover what I was capable of accomplishing." Verity's voice carried the confidence of someone who had tested her limits and found them far beyond what she had ever imagined. "Your father would be proud of what we've built here." Solomon joined them on the porch, his presence completing the family that had formed through necessity and grown into something beautiful through shared purpose and mutual respect. "Tomorrow, we start surveying the eastern sections for the new families. Grace, your legal expertise will be essential for establishing proper property boundaries. And next week, I meet with territorial officials about expanding the land fraud investigation program to other regions." The conversation continued as stars appeared overhead, 3 people planning the future they had earned through courage, intelligence, and an unwillingness to accept injustice as inevitable. In the distance, cooking fires marked the temporary camps of families who had come seeking the same opportunity that Verity had once desperately needed. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of building new lives in a community that valued justice over profit and cooperation over exploitation. The woman who had once begged, "Please take my daughter instead, I'll do anything," had become the person others turned to when they needed help, hope, and a chance to build something better. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.